Johnny Carson stopped mid-monologue. The cue cards slipped from his fingers onto the desk. He turned to Ed McMahon and said only one word. "Why?" The band fell silent. The audience held their breath. And for the first time in 30 years of television, Johnny Carson had no punchline. This is the story of a forgotten moment that changed everything. It was February 1987. A Thursday night like any other at NBC Studio One in Burbank. The familiar rainbow curtain hung behind the desk. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the faint warmth of tungsten lights overhead. Johnny Carson walked onto the stage at 5:30 p.m. for the taping, cue cards in hand, his silver hair perfectly combed, his tailored suit pressed to perfection. But something was different that night. Ed McMahon noticed it first. In 30 years of sitting beside Johnny, he had learned to read the man like a book. The way Johnny held his pen. The slight tension in his jaw. The way his eyes darted to the wings more than usual. "You okay, boss?" Ed asked during a commercial break. Johnny smiled. That famous smile that had sold a million jokes. "Never better, Ed. Never better." But Ed knew. Something was hiding behind that smile. The monologue began as it always did. Johnny walked to his mark. The audience applauded. The band played the familiar theme. But tonight, the jokes felt different. The timing was off by half a beat. And Ed McMahon, sitting at his usual spot, clutched something in his jacket pocket that would change the course of this evening. The first segment passed without incident. A comedian from New York told stories about his mother-in-law. The audience laughed. Johnny laughed. Everything seemed normal. But during the second commercial break, Ed McMahon made a decision. He had been carrying a letter in his pocket for 3 weeks. A letter that had arrived at the NBC offices, addressed not to Johnny Carson the host, but to Johnny Carson the man. A letter from a woman in Nebraska who had lost her son to leukemia 6 months earlier. The boy's name was Michael. He was 12 years old. And his dying wish had been to watch The Tonight Show with his mother one last time. She wrote about how Johnny's monologue had made Michael laugh even when the pain was unbearable. How Ed's booming, "Here's Johnny!" had become a nightly ritual. How the show had given them 90 minutes of escape from the hospital room, from the machines, from the countdown of days they both knew was running out. Michael died on a Tuesday night. The Tonight Show was playing on the television in his room. He passed during Johnny's second guest segment. His mother wrote, "I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I wanted you to know that your show gave my son his last smile. And I wanted to thank you." Not Johnny Carson the star. Just Johnny. The man who made my boy forget he was dying. Ed had read that letter 17 times. He had shown it to the producers. They said it was too sad for television. They said it would ruin the comedic flow. They said Johnny had a brand to protect. But Ed McMahon had been Johnny's partner for 3 decades. And he knew something the producers didn't. He knew Johnny needed to see this letter. Subscribe and leave a comment. Because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. The third segment was supposed to feature a young actress promoting her new film. But as the commercial break ended and the cameras prepared to roll, Ed McMahon did something he had never done before. He stood up from his chair. Johnny looked at him, confused. "Ed? What are you?" "Johnny," Ed said, his voice cutting through the studio noise. "I need you to read something." The floor director froze. The camera operators exchanged glances. This was not in the script. This was not supposed to happen. Ed walked slowly toward Johnny's desk, pulling the worn envelope from his jacket. His hands were steady, but his eyes glistened under the studio lights. "Ed, we're about to go live." "I know," Ed said. "Read it anyway." Backstage, producers scrambled. Someone shouted to cut to commercial. But the director, watching the monitors, made a different call. He kept the cameras rolling. Because what he saw on Johnny Carson's face was something television had never captured before. Johnny took the envelope. His fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded the letter. The audience, sensing something unusual, fell into absolute silence. He read. For 30 seconds, the only sound in Studio One was the soft hum of the ventilation system. Johnny's eyes moved across the page. His jaw tightened. His grip on the letter whitened his knuckles. When he finished, he didn't look up immediately. He just sat there, holding a mother's grief in his hands. Ed McMahon stood beside the desk, waiting. He knew Johnny better than anyone. He knew the man behind the monologue. The boy who grew up in Nebraska, not far from where Michael had lived. The son who had lost his own father too young. The husband, the father, the man who used comedy to hide from pain he never talked about. Finally, Johnny looked up. His eyes were wet. "Why didn't anyone show me this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "They thought it would be too much," Ed said. They thought wrong." Johnny set down the letter. He removed his microphone clip. He stood up from behind the famous desk and walked toward the edge of the stage. The audience watched in stunned silence. Doc Severinsen lowered his trumpet. The band members set down their instruments. No one knew what was happening. No one dared to breathe. Johnny stopped at the edge of the stage, looking out at the 300 faces staring back at him. "I've been doing this show for 25 years, he said, his voice raw. 25 years of jokes, of guests, of pretending that what we do here matters." He paused. "But tonight, I received a reminder of why it actually does." But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. Johnny reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph. He had been carrying it all day without knowing why. A picture of himself as a young boy, standing next to his father on a farm in Nebraska. The same Nebraska where a boy named Michael had spent his final months watching The Tonight Show. He held up the photograph. "My father died when I was young," Johnny said. "I never got to say goodbye. I never got to thank him for teaching me that laughter could heal almost anything." His voice cracked. "Almost." He looked at the letter in Ed's hands. "Tonight I want to say something I should have said a long time ago. Not as Johnny Carson the host. Just as Johnny. A kid from Nebraska who grew up believing that if you could make someone laugh, you could make their pain go away, even if just for a moment." He turned to face camera one directly. "To the mother who wrote this letter. To Michael, wherever you are now. Thank you for reminding me why I do this. Not for the ratings. Not for the applause. But for that one kid in a hospital room who needed to forget, just for a little while, that the world could be so unfair." The studio was silent. Then Ed McMahon began to applaud. Slowly at first. Then louder. The audience rose to their feet. Doc Severinsen wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. The camera operators kept filming, even as tears ran down their own faces. Johnny stood at the edge of the stage, the photograph still in his hand, the letter still on his desk, and for the first time in decades, he wasn't Johnny Carson the entertainer. He was just Johnny. A man who had finally allowed himself to feel. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. The show resumed after a long commercial break. The young actress did her segment, though she later admitted she barely remembered what she said. The audience was still processing what they had witnessed. The energy in the studio had shifted from entertainment to something sacred. After the taping, Johnny disappeared into his dressing room for nearly an hour. No one disturbed him. When he finally emerged, his eyes were red but his step was steady. He found Ed McMahon waiting in the hallway. "You could have warned me," Johnny said. Ed shrugged. "Would you have read it?" Johnny considered the question. "Probably not." "That's why I didn't warn you." They stood in silence for a moment. 30 years of partnership. 30 years of, "Here's Johnny!" 30 years of laughter and late nights and a friendship that television could never fully capture. "Thank you, Ed," Johnny finally said. Ed nodded. "That's what partners are for." The letter from Michael's mother was never thrown away. Johnny kept it in the top drawer of his desk at home, next to the photograph of his father. He read it sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet and the memories were loud. Years later, after Johnny retired in 1992, he wrote a personal letter back to Michael's mother. No one knows exactly what it said, but she kept it framed on her wall until the day she died, right next to a photograph of her son. The Tonight Show continued for decades after Johnny left. New hosts came. New audiences laughed. But those who were in Studio One that February night in 1987 never forgot what they witnessed. They saw a man remove his mask. They saw television become something more than entertainment. They saw Johnny Carson, for one brief moment, stop being a star and start being human. And they understood, perhaps for the first time, that the greatest show isn't the one that makes you laugh the hardest. It's the one that makes you feel the most. Ed McMahon was once asked, years later, what his proudest moment with Johnny had been. People expected him to mention the Emmy Awards, the ratings victories, the celebrity guests. Instead, he talked about a letter from Nebraska. That night, Ed said, I didn't work with Johnny Carson the host. I stood beside Johnny Carson the man. And that man was the best person I ever knew. The photograph of Johnny's father still exists somewhere. The letter from Michael's mother is preserved in a private collection. And the memory of that night lives on in the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. Because some moments don't belong to television. They belong to humanity. And Johnny Carson, the king of late night, understood that better than anyone. Not because he was the funniest, but because, when it mattered most, he was the most real. The ripples of that night extended far beyond Studio One. In the weeks that followed, NBC received over 40,000 letters from viewers who had watched the broadcast. Mothers who had lost children. Fathers who had never learned to cry. Teenagers who thought celebrities were untouchable gods. All of them writing to say the same thing. Thank you for showing us that it's okay to be human. Johnny read every single one. He came into the office early, before the writers arrived, before the producers started their meetings. He sat at his desk with a cup of black coffee and read letter after letter. Stories of loss. Stories of hope. Stories of people who had been carrying their own secret pain, just like he had been carrying his. One letter stood out. A man from Ohio wrote, Mr. Carson, I've watched your show for 20 years. I thought I knew you. But that night, I realized I had only known the character. Now I know the man. And the man is someone I'm proud to call a friend, even if we've never met. Johnny kept that letter too. Doc Severinsen later recalled that the atmosphere on set changed after that night. There was always laughter, he said in an interview years later. But now there was something else. A kind of tenderness. Johnny looked at the audience differently. He looked at all of us differently. Like he finally understood that we weren't just colleagues. We were family. The young actress who had been scheduled for that third segment, the one that was delayed by Ed's interruption, went on to become one of Hollywood's biggest stars. In every interview about her career, she mentioned that night. I was supposed to promote a forgettable movie, she said. Instead, I witnessed something unforgettable. Johnny Carson taught me that night that the most powerful performance isn't the one you rehearse. It's the one you feel. Ed McMahon never took credit for what happened. When journalists asked him about the letter, about his decision to interrupt the show, he always deflected. I didn't do anything special, he would say. I just knew my friend needed to see something important. That's all. But those who knew Ed understood the truth. He had risked his career that night. Producers had threatened to fire him. Network executives had called it unprofessional. But Ed McMahon had looked at his partner of 30 years and made a choice. He chose friendship over protocol. He chose humanity over ratings. And in doing so, he gave Johnny Carson, and all of America, a gift that no amount of money could ever buy. The gift of being seen. Years after Johnny's retirement, a documentary crew visited the storage facility where old Tonight Show memorabilia was kept. Among the dusty tapes and faded photographs, they found a small wooden box. Inside was the original letter from Michael's mother. Attached to it was a handwritten note in Johnny's unmistakable script. "This letter saved me. Not from anything dramatic. Just from forgetting why I started. Keep it safe. Someone might need it someday." The documentary never aired. The box was returned to storage. But the curator who found it said he sat alone in that warehouse for an hour, holding the letter, thinking about a boy in Nebraska who loved to laugh, and a man in Burbank who learned, after 30 years, that making people laugh was never really the point. The point was making them feel less alone. And on that cold February night in 1987, Johnny Carson did exactly that. Not with a joke. Not with a guest. But with the simple, terrifying, beautiful act of being vulnerable in front of millions of strangers who suddenly didn't feel like strangers anymore. That is the legacy of The Tonight Show. That is the legacy of Johnny Carson. And that is why, decades later, we still remember the night the king of late night stopped laughing and started healing.